Hello, everyone. We're happy to have Lorenzo here with us today. Lorenzo, thank you so much for joining us. How are you today?
Thank you for having me.
Uh, my first question is, what are the benefits of Web3 technology compared to traditional web technology?
Well, the number one thing that I always think of when I think about blockchain is decentralization, right? The fact that it's a decentralized technology. I remember when I was learning about the blockchain, it took me a while to deeply understand, the impact of being a decentralized technology, the meaning, right, of being decentralized. And I do think that that's still the most exciting part, right? The fact that you don't depend on anybody, the fact that you don't rely necessarily on third parties or centralized organizations, right? That enables people to get control over a lot of aspects. Clearly comes with a lot of responsibility, right? But finally, I think that, the technology is empowering people, individuals and communities, right, in a way that we've never seen before. So yeah, that for sure. The second one, maybe, I don't know how much time we had to develop this topic, but is smart contracts, right? Automation, the fact that, for example, you can own your asset, you can, get royalties automatically. For example, again, it's another example of how this blockchain technology is empowering people, right?
Yes, yeah, this answer is really full. Yes, thank you. And what are the key differences between Web2 and Web3 technology?
Well, I think that even, kind of like the definition of Web3 compared to Web2 puts an emphasis on the fact that people are owners of, their data, their information or their assets, compared to Web2, where they usually were users, right? Not owners. So for example, in video games, right? I'm not necessarily like a video game player, but I've been working with a lot of video game companies or startups. And, there is this trend of, for example, owning your own assets like weapons or skins or, characters. And that opens the door to a lot of interesting things, right? So for example, you can use those assets in other games, right? In other metaverses, for example, or you can lend those assets and monetize your assets, right? So you kind of like can get value with those assets outside of the environment where they were created, maybe, or designed, right? And this is because you are now the owner, so it's yours, and you can decide what to do, how to use it, and potentially how to monetize those assets, right? This is something that it's only achievable with decentralization and with the blockchain, right?
Yes. And can you share some key challenges you face when working and advising Web3 projects?
Well, I guess there are many challenges. I would say the number one challenge, when I work with Web3 teams, meaning teams that are trying to build Web3 startups, is that they tend to have a really, technical profile. So they tend to focus a lot on the technology instead of focusing on the user's perspective, the market's perspective, the utility, right? So I always remind them, where is the value proposition? That's the most important thing. How can you deliver the value proposition to your user? What is the product or service that you're using as a vehicle to deliver value to your customers or users, and then, think how the blockchain enables you to do so. Rather than starting from the technology and saying, okay, I had this super cool concept, for example, for a smart contract, let me now create something so that I can use my smart contract, right? I'm not saying that will always be a bad way of starting a startup. I would say, statistically, the startups that are most successful are the ones that are generating real value. And so, make sure that you use the technology for what it is, which is the tool or the mean, right? And not the objective, right?
Yes, right. And what is your response to the criticism that Web3 technology is too complex and difficult for average user?
Well, I would say it's true. It's 100% true. I don't say it's criticisms, right? I think it's actually a real statement, a true statement, And I think that we had to learn from that, right? Even in my case, myself, I do struggle sometimes using some DeFi applications. You go crazy trying to figure out where to get the tokens, how to swap them, and what platforms, and the fees, and this and that. Like, it is complicated. There is also an aspect of responsibility for owning your own assets, right? For being the owner of your wallet, right? That adds complexity to the whole process. So it is true, it's still complicated. And I think that we need to learn, right? Instead of just pushing back, we need to understand, okay, so what is an ideal way of getting this done, and how can we, design a solution that is focused on that, right? As I said before, this is not about the technology, and this is about how people use the technology. And so that should be the focus, right? Usability and accessibility. So the criticism, I think, are real, and potentially they're a great starting point for builders. Take that critics and build a value proposition out of it, right?
Yes, and can you give me any examples of the successful Web3 projects and explain why you made them successful?
Look,
can you hear me?
I've been lucky, to work with a lot of startups directly myself, or through one of the accelerators that we've been running with Rocker, now with Rayo Capital. One example that I'm happy to share is New Moon. It's a company that we actually accelerated with Rocker a couple of years ago. New Moon is a digital bank for emerging markets, specifically focused on Latin America. And I like New Moon as an example of a successful project because of two components, right? One, we've been talking about the complexity of using Web3. We've been talking about even like the responsibility of owning your own assets. And New Moon found a really smart way that allows them to take advantage of all of the benefits of the blockchain, but without exposing their users to that complexity, right? And to their responsibility, right? So from the user's perspective, you're basically interacting with a financial platform, and let me say a traditional financial platform, something that users are already used to, yet on the back end, they use the blockchain, and specifically stable coins, right, to give the users access to all of the benefits of the blockchain, right? So it's a very interesting combination, or it's a very interesting example of how the company, the product, is absorbing the complexity to deliver the maximal value to the user, right? Without necessarily making the user responsible for learning new things or anything like that. So that is a very powerful example, and I think that a lot of startups could, learn from it and try to apply it to their own projects. And the second key component of New Moon is the fact that they started by building a community first, right? Again, what I was saying before, about the technology. The technology enables you to build something valuable for the people, and that's exactly what New Moon did. They started to build this community, which started to grow actually exponentially even before releasing the product, right? And that's another big advice that I'm happy to share with any builder. Validate your value proposition even before building your product, and clearly before releasing your product, right? To make sure that you're building something meaningful and valuable, right? Don't build to then test before building, right? And New Moon did exactly that, and they got a lot of traction pre-launch, and that's why I think that they're definitely ready to grow exponentially at this point.
And have you ever worked on a Web3 project that failed, and what did you learn from that experience?
I mean, yes, of course. It would be crazy to say no. I would say, I saw a lot of mistakes, right? Technical mistakes or, product design. But I would say that at the end of the day, it all comes down to, human mistakes, right? Even if you want like the personality of the team, for example. I saw amazing projects that eventually didn't make it because the team, the founders, were not pushing hard enough, right? And it might be just because of a personality thing, right? So for example, they were too shy, so they didn't feel comfortable going out and raising money, right? And talking to investors and raising money, which was potentially what the project needed at that point, right? So they failed just because they didn't feel comfortable being a funder, right? So it was more a personality thing. Other projects failed because the funders were too good, right? So they had no patience, right? And so the cost of opportunity for them was too big. And the moment they saw, for example, that the market was going down, it was getting harder to raise money, they were so good that they could easily jump on another opportunity, and they actually ended up doing so, right? So again, it's not necessarily the product that is failing, the solution, the execution. Sometimes it's just like the management of the team or the personalities. We've been accelerating dozens of teams, and you can tell there are teams that are learning a lot and they're actually willing to learn and to apply what they're learning, and there are other teams that are kind of like going through the accelerator maybe because they think that it's good for the company, but they're not really like open to learn, and they're not implementing what they learn. So again, there are many reasons, but I would say at the end of the day, it's a human thing. So if you're trying to start your company, of course, think about the technology, think about the product, the market, the numbers, and all of that. But also think if you feel that you are the right funder for the company, right? Like try to really understand if you really want to do that.
And while working with a Web3 project, have you ever encountered any legal or regulatory challenges?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are challenges. For example, I've been working with some projects that were focused on tokenization of assets, right? Like real estate, for example, and that is subjected to like regulations at a, nation level. Like every country has potentially different regulations. So, and that is kind of like complicated when you're working with blockchain, because you tend to think in terms of like global solutions, right? The blockchain is a technology that enables you to quickly deploy a solution globally, right? And so people focus on global problems and they try to build global solution, but then they face, the practical complexity of launching their product or the solution in specific countries, right? So tokenization, for example, yes, we had a lot of considerations about regulations, financial products in general, especially, the example that I mentioned, New Moon, which is a digital bank, right? There are other digital companies that are trying to release payment solutions, for example, remittances, right? And those are also subjected to regulations in some cases, right? So yeah, it is a thing, but I'm not talking about necessarily Web3 regulations. I'm talking about maybe, Web2 regulations, meaning financial regulations or real estate regulations, right? So it's not only necessarily the lack of regulations for the crypto space, and it's normal because for me the typical project is not, as I said, a Web3 project. It's a real life project. It's a project that solves real life problems with the blockchain, right? But eventually the value proposition is always for real people in real life, and this is why you also had to deal with real life regulations, not only with crypto regulations.
How do you address scalability challenges in Web3 projects?
Well, as I said, the beauty of Web3 is that you can deploy solutions globally, right? And so you might have countries in which it's easier, for example, to deploy your solution. And so you kind of like need to change a little bit your mindset. So typically when you start a company, you tend to be egocentric, geographically speaking, meaning you tend to launch it where you are, and then you tend to expand, basically in circles and gradually, right, from the location. So for example, I'm based out of Miami, right? So the typical thing would be to launch my product in Miami and then to take over Florida and potentially then the States. So I go to Latin America and then gradually, right? But in crypto, you're definitely not limited to a specific geographical region, right? And so it might make more sense to launch your solution not where you are, but in a different region or market where maybe regulations are more flexible or open or positive or whatever you need, right? And so again, like that's the beauty of blockchain. It's a global technology for global problems. So try to prioritize those regions and those markets where adoption might be easier, and then, try to attack the hardest markets once you have a little bit more experience and traction.
Okay, and what do you think is the biggest risk facing the Web3 ecosystem in the next few years?
Well, I'm extremely optimistic, right, about Web3. So I don't think that we're going to have any issue with regulations overall. I think it's going to take time, but eventually, there's too much value in Web3. And so regulators will eventually, get together and create a framework that is supporting the expansion of Web3 rather than limiting it. So I don't think it's going to be about regulations. I don't think it's going to be about scalability. I think that there are so many smart minds building the blockchain infrastructure that we can definitely envision massive adoption and massive opportunities, let's say, for the masses, right? I think we will have to keep an eye on interoperability. I think that when the industry started, we were all focused on building like specific ecosystems, potentially like different blockchains, right? And so the focus was on growing all of those ecosystems, like getting more builders, getting more investors, and developing the ecosystems kind of like in silos, if you want. I think that now there is a lot of interest in removing those barriers and making sure that these solutions are potentially compatible with multiple blockchains covering multiple ecosystems. And I think that that's a great trend because, as I mentioned, already a couple of times during this interview, it's all about the value proposition. It's all about the user, right? So the user doesn't really care what blockchain or what technology specifically you're using, right? So I think that interoperability is going to be, very interesting. And it's not easy, right? So I think that that's kind of like one of the things that I would keep an eye on, but I'm definitely positive on the outcome of interoperability. And eventually that will allow, massive adoption. I think we're getting there. This is still the beginning of the growth of the industry, but I do envision a world in which, Web3 based solutions are going to be used globally by billions of people. I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow, right? There are challenges, as we said, user experience and interoperability and all of that. But I think that we're definitely building the right path towards massive adoption. So, you need to be patient, but we're going to get there.
Okay, Lorenzo, I have one last question for you. What advice do you have for companies looking to adopt Web3 technology?
Well, it might sound a little redundant, right? I'm kind of like an old dude with an old broken record, but if you're trying to start a company in Web3, forget about the Web3 piece and focus on the startup piece first, on the business piece first, right? As I said, Web3 or the blockchain is an extremely powerful technology. I'm super optimistic and excited about the blockchain, but it's not about the technology. It's about what the technology enables you to do in terms of generating value for your users, right? And so, as I said, I've been leading accelerator programs for a while, specifically Web3 accelerator programs. And so I work with Web3 founders literally on a daily basis. And this is usually where I have to come in and say, hey, it's all good, but where's the business? Where is the value proposition? And how are you going to develop the project in a sustainable way, right? Clearly you need a product, but you also need a business model, but you also need a financial model. You might need to raise money. It's maybe unfortunate, I wish the world was a little bit more romantic, but at the end of the day, this is 90% of companies need to raise money. Okay, learn that game, and do what you got to do in order to provide your project with enough gasoline, to make it. Right, so don't be naive. Don't think that you're gonna build it and people are gonna buy it. It's not that simple. A strong product is key, but it's not the only thing. So work on all of the other areas that you might not be familiar with, like business, like building a team, defining a fundraising strategy, talking to investors, marketing, sales, right? So be really realistic. Don't focus only on the one or two things they're really good at. Focus actually more on the other areas of the business that you need to put in place and that you might not be, familiar with. So.
All right, Lawrence. Yes. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
All
Okay.
right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Have a good one.
Bye.